Many believe that the West Coast, East Coast elites have been the creators and disseminators of neoliberal thought and practice, much to the detriment of the American worker for over a quarter of a century. Is this true? Was communism inadvertently good for American union workers, and did it lead to higher wages? Fact is, when it comes to ferreting out the Platonic truth about neoliberalism, the Soviet Union and international communism cannot be ignored. Can venture capitalists, Wall Street, financial modernizers, and IT pioneers continue to push their globalizing agenda forward? And should they be able to? Is the demise of the neoliberal order hidden by the smokescreen generated by our fiery culture wars? Has the rise of Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders pushed the neoliberal order to its breaking point? Find out on Emir Phillips' American Pragmatist.
Ignoring all of the remedies, believing all of the rumors, with their endless database. I wanna sit with my enemies and say we should have done this sooner, while I look them in the face. Maybe that will crack the case.
I know I'm bouncing about a bit here. I'm just like a lot of thoughts spinning. Like I believe before you mentioned Frederick Hayek, in terms of neoliberalism, I guess given his association with like Bitcoin and libertarians, which, like I've taken interested in, I've looked at it a bit, could you give further discussion to his involvement with neoliberalism, I guess is what I'm looking for.
Well, he was the enemy, of neoliberalism. He's an Austrian economist, and for him, spontaneity in his eyes was the only way to prepare for the unknowable future. Society had to maintain a spontaneous self, even at an institutional level, because the future was uncertain. So, cultivating a market economy would reward acts of spontaneity and result in larger economic growth and prosperity. So, he would be extremely pro Bitcoin on that basis. Take a shot, and preferably without the government. So he'd be a huge fan of Bitcoin. I feel very safe in saying.
All right, and like I know we've talked about before. I've tried various different things in my life, but I do kind of want to be a little more of an independent, business person in my own regard, selling, whether it be insight to me, a little bit of my independent writing, or maybe physical training, but a small business owner, more or less, a little bit of an entrepreneur. So I think a little innovative spontaneity to be key to a business success in some regard. So what philosophically institutionalized this for Hayek, I guess?
Well, spontaneity, it's in his most famous book. It's a huge book, Constitution of Liberty. And he viewed spontaneity as the essence of liberty. So he combines a small business owner and the spontaneity and the entrepreneurial spirit, which Reagan was a huge fan of, as the essence of liberty. So the ability to freely enter the market to make a living for yourself was an expression of art, spontaneity, innovation, and independence and liberty all came together for Hayek. So, a politician who embodied his view and was a business owner, although he was a bigger business owner, was Senator Goldwater. And, he highlighted that, and I quoted Hayek in his presidential campaign. And, Reagan gave a very famous speech advocating for Senator Goldwater, who was slaughtered by LBJ, by the way, in '64. But Reagan gave a very profound speech where you could see Reagan coming, and he was just fine-tuning himself. And he was also, Ronald Reagan was an avid reader of Hayek. So the connections are not happenstance between neoliberalism and Frederick Hayek and the Austrian School of Economics, which is heavy libertarian, but the Republican Party, Reagan and Goldwater picked it up. Goldwater unsuccessfully in '64, Reagan successfully in 1980.
So then for Hayek, freedom to do business was set down by the Founding Fathers.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Hayek regarded the U.S. Constitution of 1789 as the governing framework. I mean, it was the most important document that nurtured freedom realistically, institutionally for humans in the world. So the American experiment, he was not an American citizen. For him was to be cherished, celebrated, and protected at all costs. And in that regard, Hayek, Reagan, and Goldwater were all singing from the same hymn book.
Now, all right. Now, I guess latch onto that a little bit. Now, this aspect of neoliberalism, it differs from the other two aspects you discussed, which emphasize control, political and ideologically speaking.
Yes, that control was to reinstate institutionally the free market against the excesses of the state in FDR's New Deal. And ironically, Reagan used the state to deregulate the state and empower the free market. Just like, look, Newt Gingrich and Clinton are referred to, they used the state, Congress, to negate the law preventing commercial banking and regular banking to entwine, and they use the state to deregulate banking to allow what ended up becoming structured finance or securitization. So if you want to understand the power of the neoliberal ideology, you got to grasp this desire not just for control, but to re-inject freedom, which oftentimes means deregulate. They want to re-inject freedom, or to use Hayek's word, spontaneity, and even unpredictability, because that's correlated with freedom into politics, society, and economics. It's across the board. Remember, it's a vision of the good life, and the good life is beyond just money or economics. It involves society and politics as well. So this desire is what Hayek meant when he talked about creating the conditions in which the unexpected, the brilliant, and the revelatory and the artistic could appear, and what Reagan put in more common parlance is the American dream. And freedom and the American dream are tightly wound together, and there is no American dream without the market getting fair play. And that's what Reagan sold, or advocated. That was his vision.
All right. So I guess since you keep kind of mentioning FDR's New Deal, I guess how do neoliberalism, how did it basically take over the world after communism fell? Like give me that layout.
All right. In the 1990s, corporate capital still wanted the U.S. government's assistance in opening up international markets. So the irony is, again, we're using the state, the U.S. government that's preeminent after the communists fell, the Soviet Empire fell, to open up global markets. In a world cleared of international communism, its biggest opponent, capitalism, capital and its corporate management, Wall Street, they felt the need to compromise with labor less and less. So by 2000, corporate capital, Wall Street, felt ready to go fully global without any regulatory restraints, since nationalization of capital was no longer a threat anymore. So that's where you have the Glass-Steagall Act going down around 2000. That's not a coincidence. You have China coming to the World Trade Organization between 1998 and 2001. Not a coincidence. So Wall Street was getting its legs going, and it was going to go global.
So then after 1991, no country movement in the world was in a position, or at least so it seemed, to challenge the capitalist neoliberal way of organizing economic life. There was no longer a need for capitalists to, purchase insurance against such challenges by paying, American workers the high wages the New Deal, that order demanded.
Yeah. Yes, that's correct. Ironically, worse still, the high wage insurance policies, they could be dropped in toto, and labor protest against wage cuts ignored. Or they could be met by threats to ship production abroad, which we did. We moved a lot of our manufacturing base to China. So if you threaten to unionize or strike, I'll just move the entire, which is legal, I'll move the entire factory, legal under the Taft-Hartley Act, I'll move the entire factory to China. And that happened a lot, and it's still happening.
Yeah, it's a little ironic now looking at it.
The defenders of this hyper-globalized capitalist order, they argued that whatever American workers lost in wages would be counterbalanced by fall in the retail or consumer price of products now manufactured abroad for a fraction of their former cost, because they were using slave labor and they weren't paying for tech through trademarks or patents because they usually oftentimes stole it. So of course this utterly fails to ask, how do I pay for these cheaper goods if my wages are cut to the bone or worse? So what this, I've been replaced by a slave in China working under conditions no American worker would tolerate without grabbing a Second Amendment gun. And so if I lose my job, I can't pay for the cheaper stuff. So it's the Americans who kept their jobs, corporate management and the wealthy, the top 10%, the top 20% of America, that disproportionately benefited from the cheaper consumer products, not the unemployed, which were growing.
Yeah, so in summation, like unions were in trouble after communism fell. Like they took a downturn.
To be clear, private unions, yes, public unions, no.
Okay.
Government workers, who were already protected, and government workers have always been well protected because the theory was, if you're a police officer, you work for the government, so we're going to treat you well. They can never be fired willy-nilly because you can't unionize. Government workers were precluded oftentimes if it was necessary to society, like the police or firemen, because if you strike, we don't have a police force. If the firemen strike, we can't put out a fire. So we're going to treat you kind of quasi like you're a union, but not quite. So, but you can't unionize. Well, they in the 70s and 80s said the hell with it, and they unionized, and they did it successfully, such that now government workers have unions and they're super protected, ironically, overprotected, I would argue, and private workers don't have any protection. So government workers of all stripes, state, federal, municipal, and national, they can't be fired, basically. They cannot. And they are overwhelmingly promoted based only on seniority and not job skills, productivity, or competence. And this is true now. And this gives unions a bad name, and it gives it a black eye, But in the private sector, which is the largest sector by far these days, it's every man for himself. It's essentially a tropical jungle in the private sector and a working cemetery in the public. It's ridiculous. It's dichotomous, dualistic, unfair. And that's why everybody wants a government job. You're on easy street, because if you're not, you're all on your own. You're competing against slave labor. It's fundamentally not fair. Hence the word fair trade.
Yeah, coming from someone who's worked both for private institutions and government institutions, so you have a government job is quite cushiony in terms of the amount of labor you have to put in and the amount you get out of it.
Not to mention the pension, the benefits, the holidays, the sick leave. American workers don't get pensions. You're lucky if you got a 401k. The company gives 3%.
Yeah, it's something different. But unions, coming back to unions real quick. Union numbers, I guess, were falling before communism, though.
Yeah, but by the 1990s, membership in trade unions had almost halved since Nixon presidency, like 29 to 16% of the workforce, the non-agricultural workforce. So public sector unions held their own, because we just talked about this in the 90s. So they did just fine. But private sector workers were getting clobbered, and still are.
Mm-hmm. All right. But private employers, were not so constrained, like the ease with which they could shift production abroad, in this post-communist global capitalist world, incentivized them to resist their workers' demands for better wages, and working conditions as well. Is that a fair assessment?
Oh yeah, the ability, because the technology got smaller, it was easier and easier, not to mention software applications when that kicked in later on. It became easier and easier to move the workforce, the factory or the firm, to another country with less cost. So by 2000, the percentage of American workers in the private sector in the union, it sunk to 9%. That hadn't been seen since the early 30s, when the unions were using the mob, the mafia, to fight the police in the streets. There was a massive labor rebellion in the 30s that propelled the New Deal into existence. So ironically, you have the precondition of the New Deal, labor rebellion of the 30s, the same number, 9% in unions, you do today. Does this mean we're on the verge of a New Deal? I don't know. But back to 2000, a key point, probably because it's 2000, I'm using it, but the institutional matrix that brought labor such important gains during the New Deal, it had been largely wiped out by 2000. With China coming to the World Trade Organization, the Glass-Steagall Act, it set the tone. And keep in mind, this was all under the Democrats, under Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton and the Democrats controlled the White House for most of the 90s. It was under Clinton the union suffered the knockout blow, not Republican.
I guess did this de-unionization have any social economic effect in the U.S. in any regard, or?
I can't say the deunionization was the sole cause, but I would argue it's certainly correlated to, during this time, income inequality rose sharply in these circumstances. The middle class is getting slaughtered. The American dream is gone. No more you getting a house and a white picket fence, with a blue collar job, like they were in the, we're falling back yet again, I say, to the pre-New Deal levels. Between 1980 and 2005, the top 5% of income earners received more than 80% of the nation's increase in income. So what we gained in those years, 80% went to the top 5%, thereby doubling their share of the nation's overall wealth. I mean, that's criminal. And another factor, fact, the ratio of CEO, corporate executives, annual earnings to the average worker earnings, they tripled in the 25 years between the 60s and 1990. In Japan, a worker wouldn't make, but maybe a Japanese CEO in the 80s might make 7, maybe 12 times more than a worker. In America, it's hundreds of times, And in the 10 years after the fall of communism, it tripled again. Until then, the CEO was earning in a year, and this is hard to believe, 368 times what the average worker was bringing home in his or her paycheck. And you got to keep in mind, in 1965, that ratio had been 20 times the average American worker's pay. So in 1965, your average worker on a factory floor and the CEO of Ford or Chrysler, on average, made 20 times more than the average worker. Well, that's, and in Japan, it was like 12 in the 80s. So they're not that far off. 400 times is the average. This is insanity. This can't keep up.
All right, there's a lot of feelings and thoughts here, but to try to keep us a little bit on track, I think the thing I'm latching onto right now is, like, I always hear that the unemployment, decreased under President Clinton, though. It's like,
yeah. President Biden in his State of the Union address recently said that more Americans are working 2 jobs now than ever before. They have less health benefits than before Obama, and and a lot of these jobs were just regained for what we lost in COVID. So these stats, you got to be very leery. They can become easily politicized. So there were benefits to the labor market in the 90s, especially in terms of job creation and declining unemployment. But here's the key but. The increase in the number of jobs was not matched by increase in pay. Don't ever let a president of any party talk about an increase in number of jobs if it's not contextualized in terms of increase in pay in relation to inflation. Increase of pay has to be in relation to inflation. So an overabundance of crappy jobs under the Clinton years is nothing to brag about in my mind. So the inadequacy of wages is critical, and it forced more and more households in the 90s to depend on the earnings of 2 or more members. Women really started joining men in the workforce in large numbers in the 90s, and people forget about that. Why? Because men were working more and making less. Women join the workforce, well, then there's a job increase. Everyone's getting paid less, more people are working. Is that a win? I don't think so.
Yeah, I recall, women joining the workforce, was hailed as a feminist advance, signaling employment opportunities for women that had not been there before.
Yeah, that's here we go again, politicizing a statistic your way. The truth is most women did not have a choice about whether they wanted to work. Their families required, demanded, necessitated the income. Moreover, many jobs have become less secure than they'd once been, since more and more workers could be fired at will. They're called at will workers. You don't have a union to protect you. So now more workers could be fired. You're not even working with minimum security. And more households suffered an income decline of 25% or more a year from getting fired from better jobs. So when they lost a better job and they got a new job, it on average was a huge pay cut. And this occurred throughout the 90s. So, and this is occurring now as well. People are getting jobs, remote or with otherwise, that are having less and less benefits, less pay. Right now, wages have gone down 4.5% in the last 2 years, productivity 6%. So inflation is through the roof. I mean, high, it's even admitted by the Biden administration to be 10%. When you contextualize all these facts, it puts the job creation argument in a very different light. So no matter what party's advocating or promoting job increase, it needs to be contextualized.
Yeah, that type of decrease in income would necessitate two incomes for many families. I know I've held two jobs before, so has Anya in the past. But with the New Deal discredited and neoliberalism, free market capitalism running most of the globe, could Americans, practically speaking, of course, even imagine organizing a world on something other than capitalist principles? Is that like
I would say
something
no, it wasn't even on the agenda. It wasn't in the mindset. So all of a sudden we had the great financial crisis in 2008, 7, 8, 9, then all of a sudden, things change, and I think too, there was a philosophy from Francis Fukuyama in his book, The End of History and The Last Man, published in 1992, that kind of said, we reached the Hegelian commanding heights. This is as good as it's going to get. History's over. We've done it. This is it. So from Fukuyama's first book, The End of History, until the great financial crisis, 18 years roughly, people thought, and I did, it was over. We won the Cold War. This was the new reality indefinitely, possibly forever. I know that sounds crazy now, but then when the wall fell, it was such a magnificent win. It was global. We won the world. History's over. It's going to be kind of like this forever. So,
forgive me, I don't really know who Francis Fukuyama is.
He was a fierce critic of communism, and Fukuyama, but he did respect the radicalism of communism's critique of liberal democracy. And communism, he argued, it created spaces, geopolitical and ideological, in which capitalism could be challenged, confronted, faced off. Communists, like capitalists, made their creed available to people around the globe, irrespective, and this was unique about communism, irrespective of nationality, ethnicity, religion, or creed, or race. So in that sense, it was a viable competitor to capitalism. So the fall of communism, in his eyes, meant that the last universal, not taking the aforementioned into account, alternative to capitalism was gone. So by definition, liberal democracy, America, as a way of organizing economic and political life, was triumphant. There was no other viable competitor. You couldn't get more universalistic than communism, which was a radical extension of the French Enlightenment. So capitalism was never going to have another competitor. So it's over. Checkmate. This is it. History's over.
Yeah, but many other countries, though, especially in like Western Europe, people still voted for social democratic parties committed to a strong welfare state, limited on the inequalities between rich and poor, investments in public goods, parks, the arts, strong public transport systems, and and similar things, that still existed.
Yes. But those social democratic parties had themselves once been socialists, more radical. But by the 1990s, those countries you're alluding to, the Scandinavian countries, which the progressives will still allude to, they were increasingly, reformist, technocratic in orientation. They were mainly more about maintaining the status quo. They were not promoting, exporting communism like the Soviet Empire. They didn't inspire the rest of the world at all. Nobody was inspired by the aforementioned, what you just said, with dreams of secular emancipation from, living like Sweden or Finland or Denmark or whatever. Like the parties of the left had been, for 200 years since the French Revolution, communism had ignited people from the revolution of 1848 that Karl Marx and Engels participated in, Engels not so much, but till 1991. And I mean, motivated to the point of killing you and killing their own. So the Swedes and the Scandinavian countries were not of that sort that you just alluded to. They were not going to execute history. So that was over.
So then with the New Deal, in complete disarray, what does the American left do at that point?
It's done what it's done, which is turned to identity politics. I mean, look at the last 5, 6, 7 years. I mean, the American left is all about identity politics. So,
I can't argue against that. But I guess my follow-up to that would be, does neoliberalism see this as a threat of any kind?
Joe Biden doesn't see it as a threat, and he's as neoliberalist as you get. So the answer is no. No, not really. These struggles over identity generated a lot of, conflict, maybe culture wars, but they don't threaten the regime, of capital accumulation as communism once did. Identity politics is not threatening Wall Street like the Soviet Empire did. I mean, you've got to be kidding me. Wall Street is not worried about identity politics at all. So long as you make the money, they don't care what you identify as. You identify as a cardboard box. Multiculturalism, cosmopolitanism, another word we use now, globalization, could and did thrive, and it thrives right now under the Biden administration, under the conditions of neoliberalism, even as pressure on the capitalist elites in our Northeast, especially, and their supporters to compromise with the working class are vanishing. So while the progressives are keeping us occupied with identity politics and not threatening Wall Street at all, the working class of Americans in the flyover states are getting crushed. So then
regardless of how people may feel about identity politics, whether they're relevant or not relevant to them on a personal level, they're not really helping the working class, the poor, or the disenfranchised. It's not.
Hell no. Hell no, they're not. Far from it. The exact opposite. If you're super rich and female, you get affirmative action. Hillary Clinton gets affirmative action if it files for a job. It has no basis whatsoever in working class or being poor. The poorest white male gets no affirmative action. The richest, most affluent African American absolutely gets affirmative action. So if an employer at a big corporation has to hire a woman, for example, you think they're going to hire a woman from an elite Harvard background or a poor white woman from West Virginia? This analysis holds true for African Americans, homosexuals, Latinos, or any other classification the globalizing left comes up with.
Okay, all right. So I guess so this movement is actually distracting America from seeing American worker wages continue to fall from the neoliberal, I guess, cutting the cost of labor by outsourcing much of it to the communist China, for example.
Obviously, yes, absolutely. Total distraction. If you care about wages and the socioeconomic issues we've been discussing, sure. Wall Street could care less about that.
All right, then let's take a step back just for 1 second here. The collapse of communism, it opened up the entire world to capitalist penetration, shrank the imagination and ideological space in which opposition to capitalism, to capitalist thought, and practices might incubate. And I guess from there, I'm just trying to say, I guess, and impelled, those who remain leftists to redefine their radicalism and alternative terms, I guess I would say, which in turn, it turned out to be that capitalist systems could more easily manage, I would say, like multiculturalism, globalization, and identity politics. Is that, I know I'm just trying to piece this together it's a lot to kind of pull together, but I'm kind of coming more.
I would say it's not bad. It's a little wordy, but I think that is the exact moment when neoliberalism in the US went from being a political movement to a political order. And I would argue it came under the Clinton administration. It was a Democrat. So party affiliation is kind of secondary.
Yeah, and forgive me my wordiness. It's just like this is much more your language than mine. Economics is its own language, and I'm always trying to keep up. I'm always aspiring to do better. But in regards to the Clinton administration, though, I guess because President Clinton was working tirelessly behind the scenes to get communist China into the World Trade Organization, to enable Wall Street to outsource American jobs, which they sold to America by promising cheaper consumer goods, I believe.
And to be fair to Wall Street, they did deliver on that. I mean, a 50-inch TV did get cheaper, and the stock market did boom because it did reduce corporate costs. Oftentimes for firms, corporations, manufacturers, your biggest cost in a product is labor. And if you can reduce labor costs by going to China, you increase the profits of your company, which increases stock prices. So it's no fluke that stock prices went up. But this is the demarcation. This is the end of the marriage between Main Street and Wall Street. The war between Main Street and Wall Street now occurs. It's not just about cheaper consumer goods. That led to lower labor costs, higher corporate profits, which means higher stock prices. So retirees, 401ks are happy, Wall Street's happy, and Americans are out of a job on Main Street. Now we're getting a serious problem here between Wall Street and Main Street. They're not talking to each other anymore.
Yeah, because like the long-term effect of this was job loss, loss of jobs and much lower wages for American workers, to the point that we today are left with this ever increasing gig economy. Like I mentioned before, like I've had several jobs before at once. In college, I had three, at some points. And this is the same for the American worker, where one American worker has to work 2+ jobs with no benefits. I've been there.
Unless you work for the government, unless you work for the government or a large corporation.
That, yeah, which
by and large corporation of the government.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which I can attest to. I've had those government jobs before. Very, very nice, sort of cushion to like know you can always kind of fall back on. But back to President Clinton real quick. He also was for increasing rights for homosexuals and women, though, at the same time.
Even while voting for welfare reform, which was a neoliberal agenda. Remember, the neoliberals weren't against increasing rights for homosexuals and women. So he's also doing welfare reform. None of this conflicts with the neoliberal. We've discussed this. So meaning, less, but when I say Clinton welfare reform, let me be quite clear. That means less welfare, less of a safety net for the poor. So Bill Clinton, the Democrat, was voting for less of a safety net for the poor. And he also imposed tougher criminal penalties, which also disproportionately fell on the urban poor. So the urban poor under Clinton took a hit. How he's managed and Hillary Clinton not to take the black eye for this amongst African Americans is beyond me. I don't know how he managed to pull it off. He is a charismatic and phenomenal politician in that regard.
The power of cool is something else, Emir. I'm gonna tell you
right now. Play the saxophone and you can do whatever you want.
Do whatever you want, my man. And we're boxers. Yeah. But in the long run, though, like the urban poor and American workers, especially in rural areas, as you already mentioned, would suffer greatly from what started, to steamroll in the Clinton administration.
Yeah. And, like I said, cheap prices don't matter when I don't have a job. But when I get a job, there's no benefits and I can be fired at will because I'm not union. I mean, that's the heart of what we're talking about here. And President Clinton empowered Wall Street and communist China. And like we said before, many Republicans were right there with them. And, we call them rhinos now. Mitt Romney being an absolutely picture perfect example of vulture capitalism. So,
now that very dynamic right there, coupled with the great financial crisis, that my generation loves to talk about, it would bring the two new socioeconomic paradigms under populist President Trump and the more progressive social democrat, Marxist, however you want to brand, him, Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, I think that's well said. Yes, I agree.
But I do want to bring up one point is like through all this, we did kind of skip over Bush's presidency in '88.
He had 4 years, but the short-term problem Bush faced, senior, was that he had a recession in 1991, which cost 4.5 million Americans their jobs and raised unemployment to 7.8%, the highest level in a decade. So that was bad for him. It definitely was a kicker why he didn't get reelected. But the deeper problem was not a cyclical downturn, but the long-term erosion of America's manufacturing base. What good would Bush's victory over the Soviet Union, and against Saddam Hussein, because he had the highest ratings of any president in popularity when they polled in U.S. history. It was like 90% after the first Gulf War. But Americans kind of asked themselves after, and it was only months later he lost to Bill Clinton, which is shocking to go from the highest rating to losing. But Ross Perot was a huge factor in that. Had Ross Perot not run, I think Bush would have won. Ross took more Republican votes than Democrat, I believe. But what does it matter about defeating the Soviet Empire if what Reagan said was the American dream, and the American dream has to have economic prosperity, according to Hayek, spontaneity, Reagan, what he said, Milton Friedman, Thatcher. Where is it? If we won the war, and then we have all this unemployment and a recession, the recession made the victory over the Soviet Empire, 4.5 million jobs is no small amount, kind of bittersweet, and it made America stop and think. And remember Bill Clinton's campaign. James Carville said it. The heart of the election was this: it's the economy, stupid. It's the economy, stupid. You heard that thousands and thousands of times. That was, Obama was hope and change, right? Bill Clinton's motto was, it's the economy, stupid, which I must say was a very poignant and hard-hitting if not self-evident, truism. And Bill Clinton focused on jobs, and George Bush Sr. focused on the win and his foreign policy, which was very impressive. But at the end of the day, for most Americans, foreign policy and defeating the Soviet Empire was about, remember, the vision of the good life. And the essence of the vision of the good life first comes to is the economy stupid more than anything else. So I think Bill Clinton got him on that.
Yeah, and all this was kind of very well articulated in the '92 presidential campaign by Ross Perot. You know, the precursor to
big time
Trumpian economics sort of thing. Yeah, so okay, we talked about neoliberalism's penchant for innovation, let's say, and like capitalism's spontaneity run wild. Like, is there a dark side to this sort of viewpoint?
Well, I mean, in terms of tech, the internet and social media, I mean, let's go back in time. I recall some critics tried to warn Americans that not every aspect of the internet age was new and beautiful. For example, in the Gilded Age in American history, the 1870s to 1890s, it offered a cautionary tale of stunning technological breakthrough and industrial creativity. And everyone said that was was global order, international trade. England's Navy protected everything. Chicago had fairs that people couldn't believe what was going on. The American economy was booming. This was a new world order. If you'd have talked to people in Chicago after the Chicago Fair in the 1990s, they would have said, man, this is new. And then all of a sudden World War I hit, Tweed, the Antitrust Sherman Act hit because you had Standard Oil, monopolies hit, corruption, you had the muckrakers, income inequality. Jack London wrote a lot about it. So all of a sudden, the Wobblies got 10% of the vote in 1900 and 1910. They were basically social communist precursors. So from 1870 to 90 to all of a sudden 1890 to 1910, boom, monopoly, corruption, inequality. It didn't turn out like we thought. And I would argue the same for the internet. So,
yeah, I remember. I mean, high school seems so long ago at this point, but back then when I was learning about the Gilded Age, like the first time, when a previous generation of innovators was transforming America, when we went from farmers to like urban industrialists, that's kind of like that's what it was all kind of like viewed as.
Yeah, and the innovators then were the captains of industry, railroads. Remember AT&T, telephone, telegraph wires. Lots of inventions going on. Many of them still affect our lives. Steel production going through the roof, oil and gas, Standard Oil kicking in, electricity, manufacturing. I mean, new chemicals, everything was going off all cylinders. So it was easy to believe in a new age.
Yeah, but for all that brilliance of their work in generating capital, jobs, new products, everything you just mentioned, these corporate innovators were also kind of ruthless in the pursuit of economic and also political power.
I mean, I've referred to it, but Ida Tarbell, Lincoln Stevens, they were the muckrakers I was referring to earlier, the journalists who were relentless in their efforts to expose the unsavory practices of Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, the robber barons. We don't have an independent press like that now, apparently. I don't know where the hell our muckrakers are, but the muckrakers then, they laid bare, for the reading public, like you just alluded to, these men's insatiable desire or drive for power and profits, and their single-minded determination to crush all competition, which took the socioeconomic form of monopolies, which the Sherman Antitrust Act and Teddy Roosevelt had to deal with. So it didn't end up all peaches and cream like we thought in the 1870s.
Yeah, and I can't help but see like a similarity between, if like people are looking for more of a modern example, kind of like Zuckerberg with Facebook.
Absolutely. Big tech censorship, same thing. Zuckerberg's, to my mind, is no different than the excesses of Vanderbilt and JP Morgan, or Bill Gates. Before he became so rich, the only thing left for him to do was avoid taxes with his various nonprofit foundations, and his 501Cs, which, by the way, should all get audited. But, Bill Gates rose by crushing and incorporating tons and tons of companies into Microsoft, and needed a Supreme Court decision to save him. And, now it's easy to put on a happy face, but there were a lot of bodies on the road to Microsoft's creation.
Yeah. So I do remember all the stories of Bill Gates, buying up companies or creating smaller companies to compete with them to ultimately buy them out. But
that's right.
But ultimately, at the end of the day, high tech and social media are those very robber barons that you alluded to. Those are the modern day ones, right?
Yeah, because they can have monopolies because of the network effect. First one in wins, and the internet's global. So once you're in and you're set up, how do you compete? How do you defeat that monopoly? I would even say they're more integrated structurally, socioeconomically, and institutionally than the robber barons. So the car would compete with the railroad. I don't see that happening right now. But in terms of controlling the mind and will of America, what you just said for sure is true. But when these industries took form, though, let's go back in time to the 90s, okay?
Yeah.
They were hailed as technocratic messiahs, just like oil and gas was and railroads were when they first started. So Bill Gates and, Word and Steve Jobs and computers and all this stuff, they were technocratic messiahs, and it didn't work out that way.
Yeah, just like railroads, telegraph, the phone, and TV all at one time. That was like the epitome of the newest technology. Yeah.
The titans of the 1990s telecommunications industry had more in common with Johnny Rockefeller and Carnegie and all the other robber barons than anyone thought. Everybody sits around commenting on the coming of the new telecommunications age. Well, let me break the news to you. It's not new. At the time, the telegraph was just as stunning as the internet. It shrunk the world for most people, practically speaking, just as much as the internet. It's the same old plundering of public resources. The telegraph took up space 10 feet above you with the wires. The internet has its own infrastructure. So, now you just have funnier, different looking real estate. You can't see it. It's cyber reality, the internet, NFTs, and so on. But it's still there. It's still there.
All right. So, I guess then that kind of leads us to here. What is the last big push for neoliberalism then?
Well, we're talking about it now. I'd say the deregulation and unshackling of the telecommunications industry and Wall Street finance. Stiegel Act, knocking that out, which is in full. That's when full free market capitalism was achieved in the United States in the 90s with telecommunications, the internet breaking free, and the banks breaking free. When Wall Street, the banks broke free from Stiegel Act, Glass-Steagall Act, and telecommunications, internet took over our public resources. That's it. Global finance, neoliberalism, unfettered capitalism, globally, globalization. We're here. We're done.
Yeah, so this already happened in the 90s then.
The unshackling went under the name, there was a specific name at the time. If you look at the press and go back on the internet, you'll find it, financial modernization. That's the word they use. We use globalization now. They just switch the words. The meaning's the same. Financial modernization. As with the media industry, the finance industry was seen by groups on both sides of the political aisle, Democrat, Republican, as hobbled by outdated regulatory regime for the New Deal order, and that was that.
So then what was the key piece of, regulatory legislation both parties kind of wanted gone? Dismantled or...
It's what I've referred to many times now. The key piece was the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933. That was it.
Well, actually, look, you've mentioned that a lot. I'm not gonna lie. I don't really know what that is. So what did this actually do? This
Glass-Steagall Act. Yeah. It imposed an entire framework, a regime of regulation on Wall Street, and it prevented a recurrence of the wild speculation in trades in the stock market that led to the Great Crash, the Great Depression, the Great Crash of 1929. So,
all right. So how did it manage that? How did it do that?
And after the Great Depression, how it did it, or how it was supposed to do it, and it did do that, in my opinion. It separated investment banking and commercial banking, and that was the heart of the Glass-Steagall Act. Investment banks were to underwrite loans to corporations looking to expand their business, more risky, handle stock offerings, trade securities, and process mergers and acquisitions, sophisticated Wall Street stuff. And those banks, investment banks, Goldman Sachs, for example, were banned from the retail or commercial banking sector. And yet, in the great financial crisis, when this was eliminated, Goldman Sachs, Stearns, Lehman Brothers, investment banks, they were dealing with mortgages, right? Securitization of mortgages. So the Glass-Steagall Act precluded that. So, the commercial banking sector, the institution where ordinary Americans had their checking and saving accounts and mortgages and equity loans, could not work with, interface with, merge with, be acquired by investment banks. That all went away in the Clinton, George Bush administrations. And it set up the great financial crisis by allowing Stearns, Lehman Brothers, Goldman Sachs, so on and so forth, to start getting into the securitization of home mortgages. And then we're off to the races.
Yeah, so then investment banks were explicitly barred from gaining control interests in commercial banks or from using money, commercial bank depositors' accounts,
Yes.
for corporate investments, underwriting, what have you.
Yes, that's exactly right. So, the Federal Reserve was given the authority to regulate commercial banking, and the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, was set up to guarantee the savings of commercial bank customers, which most Americans know about, deal with. So commercial banks, they had to be chartered in particular states, and they were not allowed to do business in other states. So it got heavy regulation. And what that did was it prevented consolidation and monopolies from developing in the commercial banking sector. And commercial banks were allowed to invest only 10% of their reserves in private securities, which is risky. So they couldn't invest in risky stuff, which is why they tended to stick with mortgages, real estate, long-term investments. They knew their customers. They couldn't go out of state. So that's why when you got a mortgage, your bank knew you. You generally stuck with that bank for 30 years. You had a relationship banking. When it got securitized, you didn't know who had your mortgage. It became impersonal. It became a market. It became a stock, and it changed the whole dynamic.
But you could still trade government securities, right? Because they were deemed to be safe since they were backed by federal government guarantees.
Yes, and interest on checking accounts was non-existent, and interest on saving accounts was very low. So at the time, money market funds did not exist. So it was a different world. All these things changed when it got deregulated.
So what effect did this have on Americans, like when it was enacted? Like what actually did it do?
Well, Glass-Steagall, along with other regulatory legislation in the 30s, at that time, it restored confidence in the U.S. banking sector by putting it on a stable footing, and FDR did a good job with that. During that era, the New Deal era, if you can believe it, banks actually took a back seat to the corporate giants of manufacturing. Manufacturing was more important than banking. So General Ford, U.S. Steel, Standard Oil of Ohio, which became like Exxon, DuPont, Boeing, whatever, Lockheed Martin, they drove the economy, not banks. Banks provided essential services to the manufacturing corporations, but they were not the economy's leading edge, which is the exact opposite today, where a lot of innovation is financial and not in manufacturing.
But wasn't it like the era of like bankers' hours, gently, 10 to 4 work days, and of cozy and cordial relationships among the various Wall Street firms, that undernote loans and public offerings for corporations, all that, like, wasn't that?
Absolutely, because they weren't expected to do a lot. They had an easy life. They weren't cutting edge, Within the savings and loan industry, they had a thing called, not 10 to 4, as you put it, but 363, give depositors 3% on their savings, use those deposits as the basis of loans. You issue a homeowner a mortgage at 6%, and then you're on the golf course by 3 p.m. It was simple, it wasn't complicated, and it worked. And the focus of the economy was on corporate manufacturing.
Then what changed this? Like, why this go away?
The other side of the coin that drove the neoliberalism order to go global was the telecommunications industry. They were dissatisfied with the regulatory regime that was from the 70s. When finance got reformed, they got their big success in the pension industry. So it was for telecommunications got changed. Well, this all changed when telecommunications got deregulated and finance got deregulated. But the deregulation with finance first came in the pension industry.
But weren't like pensions a success of unions from the New Deal order? Like, wasn't that already something?
Yeah, it's true. Pensions were helping American workers, and it was a byproduct of the New Deal order. Yes. So unions forced employers to set aside funds that they could give to employees after their retirement. So it was a big win for employees.
I guess these huge pools of investable capital that sprang up as successful unions will spread these pension plans to more and a bunch of sectors of the economy, we're looking pretty, I would say pretty juicy to the banks, I would imagine.
Absolutely, and as non-union employers, sought to forestall unionization, by volunteering and giving workers union-grade pension plans of their own, the amount of capital, it just grew. It became gargantuan. So more and more banks, commercial and investment, wanted to get their hands on these funds, and that greatly increased the pressure to deregulate finance in the process. So it was coming from there.
So then what triggered the breakthrough? I mean, it always seems to be like law with unintended consequences.
It was. And, in the 70s, employers won legislation in Congress allowing them to replace defined benefit plans with defined contribution plans. They would eventually become 401ks. So, the former were basically pensions, and they promised every employee a set of monthly payment upon retirement and continuing until death. 401k, you get whatever the market gets for you, which is what most workers have today.
Yeah, and I know like some of the jobs I've had in the past, I know like my work, but a defined contribution specifically promises every employee something else entirely, a monthly supplement to his or her paycheck paid to an individual retirement account, like what most people would know as an IRA.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's exactly right. Upon retirement, these supplements, they serve as the employee's pension, but the retiree is obligated to withdraw a minimum amount annually for living expenses, and it keeps going until the fund's exhausted or the pensioner dies. So the pension is preferred, is better for the worker, but it's more costly.
Yeah, of course. Like, and just to be clear, like an employer would much prefer the defined contribution plan to be the defined benefit plan, since, just call a spade a spade, it makes pensioners dependent on their own funds, unable to make claims on the employer for monthly checks that could continue for 20 to 30 or even upwards of like 40 years after retirement.
Yeah,
so,
I mean, Americans started living longer in the 90s, and that worked to the detriment of the pensions, and some companies were just going to go bankrupt if they paid the pension. So, and if you're a small business, you're done, but generally the law applied to the largest companies like Ford and GM. They're the only ones that gave pensions. But as a result of these changes from the 1970s, millions of American employees began to accumulate, as you put it, IRA funds. So the cumulative size of this pot went from millions to billions and eventually trillions. And so the pressure for commercial and investment banks to sink their teeth into that was like a vampire in a blood bank. Insane.
So what calls to dismantle the Glass-Steagall Act? Like when did that begin to mount?
The Reagan administration, responded to this stuff in the 70s by freeing a portion of the commercial banking industry. It was called the savings and loan sector from regulations. It deregulated the savings and loan industry. So you saw it happening then. But it did so without eliminating the FDIC insurance. So that was in place in the 1930s. So it wasn't totally deregulated, okay? And what that did is the federal government promises to bail out any individual depositor. We all have that still, up to a certain amount of money if the bank fails. So the federal government would save the individual depositor if the savings and loan took excessive risks, which they did when they were deregulated, which led to the financial crash of 1987 and 1988. So even then, when they deregulated savings and loan, it wasn't long after we had a financial crisis based on that deregulation, which should have been a warning to not deregulate Wall Street in toto with the elimination of the Glass-Steagall Act, which was the mother lode of regulation.
So did the financial crash actually end calls to dismount, Glass-Steagall, like that happened?
No, you would think so, but no, it's talking about Wall Street. Money's money. It stalled it. I would say it stalled it for a decade, but it didn't, the movement for financial deregulation hit, and it was fortified ideologically, philosophically by the IT revolution,
Okay, wait. So how does the IT revolution have a play in transforming banking? And I can imagine a little bit, but I'm sure you know more than I do. So
the IT revolution convinced a lot of people that the ongoing tech transformation, the dot-com mania, was changing structurally and fundamentally the relationship between risk and reward. They weren't so highly correlated. In other words, the IT tech and software created, highly trained finance experts from Wall Street, as opposed to the amateurs who ran the savings and loans. So that's how they got rid of the savings loans crisis. They didn't have computers. They didn't have software that assessed risk. So the savings and loan people were Neanderthals, amateurs, pre-computer, pre-word. So these guys now in the 90s possess the IT, the ability to crunch data, the ability to manage risk in new ways that had never been possible using newfangled software that seemed like magic, got rid of risk. So we didn't need to worry about the savings and loan fiasco anymore. Let's move on.
Yes, like calculators, I guess at this point were a little bit of a thing in the past.
They were passe. They were passe. But if numbers came from software, if numbers came from a calculator, but if it came from software, it might as well come from God Almighty himself. That was the view. So the fullness and the instantaneity of the information that computers could shoot out on Wall Street, people were mesmerized, people, politicians, banks, people with money, and it convinced everyone, really, culturally, philosophically, socioeconomically, that market perfection was in the grasp of high finance. Wall Street had done it.
Yeah, and under these new finance realities, by definition, that would make more existing government regulation superfluous, more or less, and actually impediment to economic growth and development.
Yeah, if you've got software, and I'm using regulation from the 1930s, if I just argued the saving and loans was passe, calculators were passe, what would I think about regulations from the 1930s? New Deal, Depression, Glass-Steagall Act. We might as well be talking about the missing link. This is ridiculous. Software, it had changed everything. So the IT revolution was inadvertently critical in expanding the neoliberal paradigm world order to go global and to give Wall Street supreme power. So new information tech made it possible to shrink and supposedly eliminate risk, and to smooth out the highs and lows of the business cycle, which they've been trying to do since day one. So, it would be best, like you said, the neoliberals argued what you said, if government would just get the hell out of the way. So they conceded, neoliberals weren't stupid. They conceded the Glass-Steagall Act had been necessary back then, pre-IT. But now, given the tech revolution, because it fundamentally changed business, the dot-com era, and a lot of Harvard business professors were with this now. If you go back and look at their books, Harvard was with it. It was no longer needed, the Glass-Steagall Act, and it was actually hurting economic growth. So it wasn't just Wall Street. They had higher ed behind them too.
So then in that context, banking modernization was not only still desirable, but essential to our nation's economic future and all our prospects.
Yes, and that's why they use that word then. Look how the word fit what we just said. They called it financial modernization, finance modernization. The IT was modernizing everything. And that's always a good thing, right? Who's against modernization? It makes you feel like a moron if you're against it. So the new discipline specifically was called financial engineering. It attracted the best and brightest at America's top universities. As I said, higher ed was behind this. By the 1990s, our top scholars or students were flooding into Wall Street. They were intrigued by the challenge of designing complex financial instruments. Physicists were going in it, computer engineering, not just finance. People from various disciplines were jumping in to get big paydays, So it was a mad rush to Wall Street.
All right, so is this what led to what we now call financialization of the economy?
Yes, it is.
All right, so did Glass-Steagall finally fall then after this?
No, not yet. It was hanging on.
Okay.
There was more resistance, like I said, because of the savings and loan debacle, but they overcame that, as I said, philosophically, with the software argument. But in 1999, it did fall when Clinton signed the Graham-Leach bill, replacing Glass-Steagall's separation of commercial investment banks. So in 1999, it fell. And it was the Graham-Leach bill that replaced it.
So this meant that all banks were now free to compete across the entirety, of the financial marketplace, just as media companies were free to do across the entirety of the digitized marketplace.
And both of those happened, yes, to answer your question, and both of those happened at approximately the same time. And that's That's neoliberalism gone global. This is it. They now have the legal mechanism to take over the world, the media and the banks. We're done, folks. So, and ironically, a Democratic president struck down what was once considered the indispensable regulatory pillar of the New Deal order, the Glass-Steagall Act. This shows you the power of neoliberalism, the political order that an opposition, a Democrat, took out the New Deal order, Bill Clinton. So with the stock market soaring, the repeal of Glass-Steagall was generally hailed by both parties as another milestone in the construction of President Clinton's quote, his quote, bridge toward tomorrow. That's how he justified it. The new era, bridge towards tomorrow. Things are different. The IT revolution's changed everything. You know, we got to go in with the new instead of the old. And that's how President Clinton sold it with a large chunk of the Republican Party, except for Ross Perot's contingent, with him in tow.
So then I presume that the telecommunications industry was also changing radically, you know, given it was causing high finance on Wall Street, you know, to change as well.
Totally. You know, telecom reform and financial modernization, what it did was, and look at today with the flyover state nation, it tied the West Coast to the East Coast. Silicon Valley now is tied to Wall Street, San Francisco to New York. You know, both coasts, industries and megapolises, they became integral to the Democratic Party's political success. Clinton won over Wall Street, and through the telecom modernization, he won over Bill Gates' West Coast from Seattle down to Los Angeles, especially San Francisco. So the Democratic Party has now conquered the East Coast and West Coast. But at that time, 1999, America had not yet become the flyover nation it is today. So tying together East and West Coast elites to the Democratic Party was not enough. For America to fully become a flyover state, with middle America being irrelevant, fully dependent, as well as, you know, on the continued international supremacy of the United States, that's going to come in time. But it was set up by this.
Just a small note from me, just like I know a lot of people like to make jokes about flyover states, and I've lived in several of them, so I understand. But those places also provide most of your food. Just a reminder. But just want to throw it out before you start throwing shade at farmers and everything. But regardless, you know, once the flyover nation, you know, became more like relevant, only, you know, for meth production, you know, these states would go full blown red, you know, kind of for Trump. You know, it was like Breaking Bad was sort of a documentary and not a TV series, I think, in that regard. If you haven't seen Breaking Bad, go watch it. But I think that's pretty relevant to like this sort of image that we're putting up here.
Unfortunately, it is, you know, but we weren't there yet in 1999. No, and that's the end act you're alluding to. You know, the prestige of U.S. economies and ideas, it benefited philosophically, not just from the collapse of the Soviet Union, but also the rise of Thatcher in the 80s, Great Britain, and her decision to, you know, take England. She deregulated England in the same ways that the United States had deregulated itself. And, you know, to be fair to Bill Clinton, in England at the time, Labor leader Tony Blair supported in the 90s, just like Clinton carried through the revolution that Reagan started. So you had a Democrat carrying Reagan's revolution perhaps farther than Reagan would have, because he didn't try to do that when he was president. And you have Tony Blair doing what Thatcher had not done. So I don't know, liberalism is going beyond what anybody thought, but that shows the power of liberalism, that a labor leader in the Democratic Party took neoliberalism to its end culminating plateau.
Yeah, and given that neoliberalism received structural institutional support from both the Republican and Democratic parties, as well as from Great Britain, you know, we can safely say that by then neoliberalism was a world order, I guess.
I would say the world order. At that point, neoliberalism is the economic philosophy that runs the world, period. 1999, it's over. It is the world order.
So then what about the rest of Europe? Like, what's that look like?
Chancellor, you know, Helmut Kohl was reuniting Germany, so they were busy doing that. And then Europe, you know, the EU came into existence in 1993 as a single market, but what did the EU do? Neoliberalism. It allowed for the first time the free movement of goods, services, and people and capital throughout the EU member states. I mean, that's neoliberalism run amok. So the EU is a institutional representation of neoliberalism. So it is one of the first expressions of the world order, the EU.
So then you believe the establishment of the EU could be interpreted as more or less an achievement for neoliberalism?
Oh, absolutely. And the EU movement continued when they created the euro in 1999, the money, the currency union in 1999, the same year we're alluding to with Glass-Steagall. So it was a massive year in the history of neoliberalism. So the euro, through money, bound together a large subset of EU members, not all, but a lot.
And who carried the neoliberal torch throughout this process? Was it Great Britain, or was there other countries that were more staunch on it? Or
despite what I said earlier, and I may have given that impression inadvertently, but no, Germany. At Germany's insistence, fiscal discipline will be mandated to sustain euro currency unification. You would see this later in Germany's demanding austerity on Greece, Portugal, Italy, and Spain after the great financial crisis. So national governments, Germany demanded when they formed the EU and in the euro, Germany demanded national governments in Europe balance their budgets, and loans to member states would be limited to what they reasonably could hope to repay. There wasn't going to be any free lunch, especially since Germany was going to mainly be footing the bill. They had the strongest economy. So the principles converge with those that Robert Rubin had laid down in the US through his budget agreement of 1993, and later the Washington Consensus as expressed through the Monetary Fund. So Germany was in complete 100% accord with the Washington Consensus, neoliberalism, and what was going on with Thatcher's England and Bill Clinton and Tony Blair in the US and England later on. Everything was in sync. There was no dissenting voice anywhere.
So then it could be forcibly, mind you, argued that the US was carrying Europe along with its neoliberal revolution, like on its back a little bit.
Chancellor Kohl himself openly contemplated aloud when a United States of Europe, and that's a quote from him, would emerge with a scheme for economic and political integration, a wise blend of market freedom and market discipline, he said, closely modeled on the 1990s American Republic. That was paraphrasing some of that. Some of that was a direct quote from him. So the answer is a resounding yes.
So then in the middle of all this, where's Great Britain at? Like, where are they floating around?
I mean, in Britain, in the EU, it threatened one of the contradictions here is the success of neoliberalism in Britain and the EU threatened US financial dominance, Wall Street, New York, fighting London and Frankfurt, There's only so much profit to go around. So Margaret Thatcher's 1986 deregulation of the banking in the UK before America, swept aside a ton of regulation, and it went beyond what was going on in the United States, and that was also compelling Wall Street to keep up. So not only was there an IT revolution, but on a deeper thought, what was going on in England, London, because of Thatcher's revolution of neoliberalism in the 80s, Wall Street was like, man, we got to keep up with London. We need financial innovation, i.e. less regulation. So that was prompting Wall Street as well.
So then what does Wall Street do to respond to this? Like, what are they doing?
Well, initially, European and American banks, European meaning non-British, German, French, they ran to set up branches in Britain. So deregulation was allowing London to compete with New York as the premier site for innovative and high-paced financial transactions. So, the Labor Party, when it returned to power in 97 under Blair, who I alluded to early, Tony Blair, he further advanced the trends to help London maintain its edge over Wall Street. And he further, even more than Clinton, got rid of the regulatory regime in the UK by downsizing specifically 9 regulatory agencies in Great Britain into one. And he specifically instructed that one agency that remained, quote, don't do anything that would damage the competitive position of the United Kingdom. In other words, Germany, Frankfurt, Great Britain, London, United States, Wall Street were all competing to become the financial center of the world because it would, the world was at stake. Neoliberalism had won. It was the world order, and they wanted their main city to be the economic financial center of that world order. And at that point in time, I would say London was in first place, Wall Street second, and Frankfurt third. And that's another reason why President Clinton got rid of the Glass-Steagall Act, hoping it would allow Wall Street to usurp London's edge.
So that in trying to keep up, what did the EU do in response? Since one financial adaptation seems to lead to another financial adaptation at the international level, it just kind of always seems to happen crazily. At least in terms of the US and Great Britain and the EU, like how did that
we talk about an arms race, right? You got to keep up with your enemies. This is a financial innovation race. The more one country deregulated their finances, it forced the other country to deregulate more to get another competitive advantage through financial innovation. So, but to be clear, by EU, just so the viewers aren't confused, EU, I mean primarily Germany, not Great Britain. So Germany, EU, it did adapt, and it also threatened US primacy, since Chancellor Kohl, he reunited post-communist East Germany with West Germany, which was an amazing feat, and transformed the reintegrated nation into Europe's economic juggernaut. I mean, Germany pulled off an economic miracle in the 90s, integrating the country much faster, quicker, and cleaner than anyone thought they could. So Frankfurt emerged as a global financial hub in its own right, and it started flexing its muscles and competing with London and New York for their money. They're all competing for the world's money, of which is only a limited supply. So the race was on to deregulate, and the pressure was coming from everywhere now.
So with the global economy, so seemingly set in place at this point, what would happen to, I guess, American workers who now had to compete globally against workers who could not unionize and were, often paid, scraps, pittance, or whatever you want to call it?
Initially, both parties, Democrat and Republican, spoke of major commitments to education and retraining of workers that got outsourced. They both argued they had to adapt to the imperatives of the global economy, which was a fancy way of saying, suck it up.
I feel that, because I remember when I was in college, I never really saw like any higher education specifically focused on helping American workers readapt to the global economy. I didn't really see that too much. Maybe towards the end of it a bit, but that's not really
Me neither.
what I think they were focused on.
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, Levi, you don't need to go to a university for Uber training. In the gig economy, you don't need a 4-year degree for the gig economy, do you? So I think that says it all.
No, sadly, history has shown me that you do not need a 4-year degree almost for anything. But that aside, my personal not vices, my personal pains, I guess, aside from higher education, I guess, how does a communications degree in film studies or gender studies or sociology, for that matter, help you acquire gainful employment in this new global economy? I kind of see massive unemployment for middle America when I kind of look at this thing in a macro sort of
yes,
way.
Obviously, yeah, it doesn't. Education and training were not enough, especially in those degrees, and they weren't market appreciated. Workers had to be guaranteed the right to strike, and that right could only be satisfactorily protected if workers who went on strike didn't have to worry about being fired from their jobs or their jobs being outsourced abroad legally under Taft-Hartley. So the American worker from 1999 on is cooked.
So much hope for for me and my generation. But I guess in taking a step back, it seems that there's a little bit of an underside to the dramatic growth in population, of our large cities over the past, let's say, like, I don't know, 25 years, since it drained employment resources, human and physical, from, I guess, other parts of the country, small towns, rural areas, most of all, I would say. Is that a fair assessment? Or
Totally. As big cities became more computer connected, internet connected, that's where the jobs were. That's where the perception of the future was in urban areas. And it's still true today, with bigger cities getting bigger and bigger. So there's no argument to what you just said. And furthermore, the economic inequality that's so much a hallmark of the neoliberal order has a spatial dimension, which I think you're alluding to. Jobs and wealth are concentrated in the big cities, and the cosmopolitan, a word we've used throughout this podcast, cosmopolitan corridors that come from big cities, with the barrenness of economic opportunity, that's what's there. There is an economic opportunity for those who are in rural areas. They're done. What economic opportunity tends to be in big cities generally. I mean, today, you live outside a big city at your own peril, socioeconomically speaking. Good luck.
Yeah, we're becoming very much that flyover nation, as you talked about earlier.
Oh, yeah.
But now I want to move a little bit now over more to President George W. Bush, his version of neoliberalism, which I assume existed